Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the final Oxford Internet Institute's Wednesday webinar of this term, where we are delighted to welcome the co-directors and stars of the film, People You May Know, Dr. Charles Kriel and Gellein Viken, hosted by Professor Philip Howard. The film shows Charles going undercover to collaborate with a company creating a microtargeting platform for US churches that attempts to radicalise individuals, targeting the vulnerable, poor, grieving, and the addicted. We are delighted and very grateful to have the opportunity to discuss the film with Charles and Kat today. A little housekeeping. We are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request that the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and we posted on our website following the event. You can ask any question using the Q&A tab at any time, and these will be answered during the talk, so please try to keep questions as concise as possible. The questions will be visible to all attendees and can be upvoted and commented upon. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce today's host, Professor Philip Howard.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Good morning. Thank you, Isabel, for that introduction. I'm Phil Howard, Director of the OII, and it's a pleasure to welcome our guests tonight, Charles Kriel and Gellein Viken. Welcome. I think it's safe to say that most people on the call have had a gander through the documentary, and so perhaps a good program for us for the next hour is to have a short 12-15-minute conversation between Charles, Kat, and I, and then open it up for a good long exchange with the audience. And if I may start with Kat, I think I'm curious to get your thoughts on the journey that's involved in going from data to a storyline, especially a storyline that you would present visually. It just seems like, as an academic, I mean, we're used to telling stories, our stories, through tables and graphs, and that takes months of plumbing the data. How did you go from a hard drive to a storyline?
Well, thank you, first of all, Phil, for inviting us on today. I'm very happy to be here. So it's a funny question because, I mean, I was not a data person, am not a data person. Charles is very much the expert in this field. I was just a filmmaker who happened to be in Charles's company when he started doing this kind of work for the committee in Britain. So, of course, as the headlines unfolded across the world about Cambridge Analytica, about Facebook, I had the filmmaker's head on first, and I thought, you know, this is just a story that we have to follow. And I started following Charles's journey into Parliament and interviewing the MPs and watching that inquiry unfold. Now, that was going on for about a year before we realized that the legislation sorely needed to regulate the social media companies wasn't really going to be forthcoming. So we were a little unsure which direction to go with the film. And that's when continually throughout this, Charles had been data dumped by a lot of independent researchers, a lot of journalists, a lot of people who would come to him because he became sort of the middle point of all this. And I think there was one point where Charles said, look, you know, I am at capacity at doing this now. Could you have a look at the data? And that's when I started to look through the vast contents of it. And there was one in particular, and you'll have seen him in the film. He's called Brent Press, who is an OSINT researcher. And he sent something like 1,000 messages. And I had to start going through that. Charles had to start going through that. And it was miles and miles of data and very hard to initially to decipher. But because this background had happened with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and the committee, I sort of managed to discern a story in there that would be told in 3 parts. So we started off in the UK when we realized we then had to go to America, taking our baby on the road and all kinds of things. And then delving into the church side of it. I sort of saw this thing in 3 parts. And once, even later on, we realized that the Council for National Policy was involved, that became the 3rd part of the film. So it very much evolved organically throughout. And the first directive of the film was really something that was closer to the Great Hack or the social dilemma, in that we were just dealing with the committee's inquiry into the social networks. And then it grew from there.
I think one of the things I like about the film is that it's not again about Cambridge Analytica. To me, what was more interesting is the story of social inequality, that people don't understand where the data goes, and then it gets used against them to target them for things. Would that part of the social inequality vision, did that emerge when you were en route across the US, or did it emerge early, or is it just something you always care about and look for?
Well, I mean, Charles has worked with social inequality for a long time, so he can answer that too. But for me, I was discovering America as well as I went along. So I think in the film, you'll see Charles say, you know, this is what America is like with the inequalities of, you know, you either have money or you don't. And Nelson pointed out that, you know, you become dependent on these institutions. And what happens then if these institutions that you trust exploit you and they start using your data in ways that you didn't expect or you weren't aware of? So it's at the heart of a lot of what we do, and certainly it's always been at the heart of what Charles does. But for me, it was a discovery. It begged the question, you know, if our data is out there, who is buying it? And of course, institutions you wouldn't initially.
Charles, can you step in? Yeah, there's a moment in the film, I remember you say that from your point of view, there's so many people in the US who live paycheck to paycheck, or they're only a few paychecks away from losing their house. Did the social inequality angle appear to you once you were exploring the data, once you were on the road, or is it something that you always care for?
It's something that I always care for. So I've lived in Europe for 27 years now, I think, since 1993. And at first I was living in Prague working as a journalist. Then I've been in London most of the rest of the time up until the last few months when we've decamped to Oslo for a wee while. And an issue that came up to me again and again is Europeans are fundamentally different from Americans, but I can't figure out how. I can't figure out why. And it took me a good, I don't know, 15 years to figure out that dilemma. And it's one of the sequences from People You May Know when I'm driving and I'm trying to explain that why Americans are such big believers, because Europeans are not big believers in this sense. I mean, you have belief, it's very institutional. American belief is very individual, and it's very much about personal passion. And so once I had once that had gelled in my mind about this enormous difference between the two, then it's helped me to see the societal issues of the United States differently, but also the societal issues of Europe differently as well, because there are benefits and deficits to both approaches and both sets of character. I just want to say on the data front and storytelling, you know, I hit a point in the committee where I couldn't keep track of all of the witnesses' names anymore. There were too many figures. There were too many characters at play. Suddenly we had all of these Russians, and then there were lots of Ukrainians, and then there were lots of American figures involved, and there were Republicans, and there were data people, and I wanted to do this mad wall, and I'm sure Kat remembers when I tried to do it, but everything touched everything else, so it didn't make any sense whatsoever. And I wondered if I was getting old, or I drank too much in my life, or why couldn't I hold all of this together? And it's just too much data. And Kat, with really fresh eyes, was able to come from the outside and look at it and craft this into an emotional story in 3 acts. And I think it's an extraordinary skill that she has.
It's interesting. There's some ways in which journalism and social research share a vision, right? So identifying social problems, trying to do something about them, trying to educate the public or educate policymakers about this stuff. Could you say something about the challenge of doing a documentary on technology issues? So trying to teach journalists to report technology issues properly is really hard. If anybody's ever watched Dominic Cummings earlier today, or the senators question Mark Zuckerberg, you can tell it's hard to teach politicians about technology issues. And so in a sense, academics are needed, but so are documentarians. But do you have a particular approach to how to make technology an interesting subject for a doc?
I think it's very dependent upon humanizing the story, reducing it to its simplest elements as much as you don't want to do that. One of the things that I witnessed both when I came in as a witness to give evidence to the committee before I was attached to them, but then after I was advising them, is that folks who had talking points could stick to them and nail down what they wanted to say quickly fared better. And folks who really meandered with their answers and had to consider, well, what is truth and what do we really mean by it's those people that kind of got lost, because policymakers are very busy people who are handed an 80-page brief about 100 meters down the hallway as they're walking to the meeting. And that's cutting through that is really difficult.
There's also an element of emotion, I would say. And one of the reasons I wanted to make People You May Know a different investigative doc was for that reason you're talking about, Phil, because, you have the investigative doc and you have the panorama style where you have a person with a microphone and you go, look, we have this evidence and we went and we had this data and here it is. And that's great, but for lasting impact, not so much. So I really wanted to make something that was emotional. And I have to say, also have to credit one of our photographers, David McCormick, who's a wonderful guy, who at some point said, look, you're going to have to put yourself front and center of it because we need somebody to care about. And that really rang true with me. And I already sort of had Charles in it, but I thought, if you're going to care about this vast crazy wall, as Charles says, about of data and different intertwining stories, you have to have someone to follow. You have to have something to have an emotion attached to.
Okay, but Kat, one of the tools you have in your toolkit that we don't have is that, or we try not to use often, or we try to use sparingly, is the ability to create tension, perhaps artificially. So some of those scenes where Charles has the data in his backpack and he's rolling down the escalator and looking quite agitated. I'm confident he was nervous and agitated, but those are probably constructed in some ways. Or you tell me, what role does that kind of device play in drawing in the audience? And how do you decide when it's necessary and when it's excessive or not needed to bring home the punchline?
I'm going to jump in here before you answer that question, Kat, and to just say that Kat badgered me to every time I walked out of Westminster to record what I was thinking into the phone, record what I was feeling into the phone in that moment. And no, I would not normally have done that, but it became a really terrific record.
Yes, I remember, in fact, searching through emails that you had sent me with phone footage as you walked out of Parliament, and I thought, I know you had an emotional reaction, and I'm going to go find it. So that's one thing you can do when you're following a person, again, for emotional impact. It's a good, and of course, as close as I was to Charles, it was handy because I could ask him continually to go, whenever something happens, I know you can't film in the corridors, but at least record what you were thinking just after. And they really did give him that hard drive. And they really, really didn't want to carry it out of the halls. So as strange as it sounds, and we've had this question posed to us before, is, isn't some of that constructed? And I have to say, at the time, Charles brought back increasingly horrifying evidence and stories and things that were still not made public and that we couldn't touch, but things that were genuinely worrying. Another moment that we didn't put in the film was when you had to carry a laptop down the road, to a burner laptop, to put a little USB stick in that you'd been given as well, with potential incendiary evidence.
Blow up, yes.
Yeah.
I can remember the first time I met Sven Hughes, who's in the film, and I went to take evidence from him, and he had an office on Whitehall. because he had a Stratcoms company. And it was a private session, so he could let loose and tell the whole story. And just the utter shock and of how big this story was, and the characters that were involved, and how high up it all went within government, was really frightening. And hearing of violent events and retribution and intelligence agencies from other countries that we all know are really very good at what they do. And I walked out, and as I walked out of his building, a jogger went by and brushed me, and I thought, that's it, I'm dead. They're going to kill me on the street. And sure, it was probably an overreaction, but it was an honest reaction.
And not to you, I remember people you worked with at Parliament as well at times were feeling like that.
Yeah.
And I'm only kind of sad that we couldn't, get some of the more of the inner workings there. But of course, you can't film there. But there is a time and a place as well, Phil, of course, for if there's a moment. And what you can do with storytelling is, of course, you can shift the timeline of things, or you can place a reaction at the right time that will land better with the audience. But you have to be really careful. Like, our film was vetted on both sides of the Atlantic by lawyers, and it just a lot of documentaries are very, very balanced. Ours isn't really. It's quite opinionated. So in order for that to pass muster, it really had to pass legal. So yeah.
This thing about being opinionated, this thing about journalism that relies on a he said, she said, it's like if you say that the sky is blue, you have to find someone that says the sky is red. That it's neither bold nor truthful journalism, and balanced reporting, to use a tired old phrase, is not 5 minutes for the Jews, 5 minutes for the Nazis.
Yeah.
At some point you have to say what is, and that's important.
It's interesting you two say that. Sometimes I get a similar kind of question about whether political whether the nasty stuff that comes up on social media that's politically polarizing tends to come more from the ultra conservatives or the far left. And I think evidence-wise, the answer is that it's almost all from the far right. It really isn't from the far left. And you could talk about trying to teach the controversy or provide balance, but it's almost like climate change. The vast majority of misinformation we find that's sexist and racist, it comes from white supremacists. They're often domestic. They're often ultra conservative. So not small c conservative or even conservative, ultra conservative. And the amount of stuff on the other side almost isn't worth giving equal time to, because it's almost all fractional, or it's actually ghost campaigns run by ultra conservatives.
You're talking about my people.
Right.
I'm happy to hear you say that, Phil, because it's something we just discussed, wasn't it, Charles? No, I wouldn't say conservative bias. I would say it's a radical. They're no longer conservatives in the traditional sense. It's a radical right-wing bias.
Right. So let's start to take a few questions, and Kat and Charles, if you don't mind. We have a great one sort of on this theme from one of our colleagues, Ornella. She asks, other than as a medium for advertising, what role do you think that social media plays in making or keeping people radicalized? Kat, why don't you start out there, because that's sort of where you just finished. What role does social media, other than advertising, what role does social media play in keeping people radicalized?
Oh gosh, I mean, it's not just advertising, it's the whole way that social media functions these days. The social media machine is about making money, and ultimately about keeping you on the platform. So whatever keeps you on the platform will be the content that you see. And if you even started to go down a plug hole that isn't truthful, it's too easy to become radicalized and too hard to come back. And this is the power that those companies sit on. I think you could probably expand on that, Charles.
Well, there's, social media, the scrolling wall is not a scrolling wall by accident. It's a scrolling wall because it's playing on behavioral design, and behavioral design is based on I mean, you know, it depends on how deep you want to go into it, but in terms of social and online media, an awful lot of it is just based on slot machine design, frankly, in terms of the different tropes that are being dealt with. So the engagement is a polite word for addiction, and the drive for engagement and the drive for growth within that context feeds off of content that excites people. And exciting content is content that pisses people off for the most part. You know, angry people click more, and we all know that. And I'm sure that you have the numbers to demonstrate that. We certainly have the experience to show that that's the case. There's the terrific MIT Technology Review article that came out a few days ago that talks about Zuckerberg's relentless drive for growth and how that has been privileged over the need to protect society. And I think it's absolutely true. We're in a really uncomfortable position, and I feel like as journalists, as academics, and so on, we should all be learning about behavioral design so that we can really understand why we're in this situation. Everybody says, yes, Facebook is addictive, but not many people are demonstrating how and why. And I think that's critical.
It's also radicalization within your group, right? So if you're within a group of friends, and now, especially during the pandemic, online on Facebook or TikTok or wherever you are, if radicalization has happened, it's very hard to step out of, because you're in the same confirmation bias group, and to step out of that is hard because you're losing friends.
And I think just to add to that, it's important that you start to really parse this down and understand what malady people are actually suffering. You know, are you somebody who's stuck in a filter bubble where you're just hearing your opinion, your own opinion confirmed constantly? Or are you actually in an epistemic bubble where you're hearing lots of opinions, but you just utterly refuse to believe anything other than the ideologically driven ideas that you have? And these two groups of people have to be dealt with completely differently.
Okay, then let's start to talk about religion. Ideologically driven, perhaps bounded in some of the ways you were just describing. There's an interesting question from an anonymous guest on the call about liberation theology and the long-term trends in Christianity. And I think I'm going to interpret this question a little bit and ask you about how it is, why it is you think that this toolkit arrived, particularly with evangelicals in the South. And I imagine possible answers include that's just how modern religion is organized, or some churches are very wealthy and can blow money on this stuff, on the toolkit, or maybe there's something doctrinal about it, that some denominations are much more likely to play with data aggressively. What would you think? Is there a connection between religion and the use of data in this way?
The causality is from the top down, and the toolkit is there because a Mercer-funded charity that is working within the realm of Christianity decided the toolkit needed to be there, and so commissioned it and worked on the gathering of the data to make it happen. So I don't believe any of it's accidental at all. It's an extension of mail shots, and it's an extension of mass mail campaigns in the United States. And in fact, a lot of the work done from the CMP, from some of the founders of the CMPs, from some of the people who've supported Mercer and the organizations, it's the same people. The ones who are doing the mail shots are supporting the big data campaigns.
Well, what also really needs to be said, and this is not just in the US, but it's particularly prevalent in the US, is that the church holds a monopoly on people's health data insofar as they have, as you see in the film, little sister churches, or little, what is it that they call them? Little sister ministries that will have addiction recovery programs, grief help programs, all of these different places that will hold vast amounts of your very, very intimate personal vulnerabilities. And what's been done is you take that to a platform, and that has far too much power, because you're then not really talking about religion anymore. You're just talking about, when are you vulnerable and when are you reachable? And the church will always have that, because the church is where you go, certainly in America, if there's anything wrong. And if you need community and if you need help, that's where you go. So now they're sitting with that. There's another little part of this that wasn't in the film. Should we talk about this, Charles, about the founders of Glue and where they've invested elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely important to talk about that. It's really critical.
Yeah, so in terms of health data, some of the founding investors in Glue, the company that's rolled out this platform, are also the founding investors in things like Headspace, if you've ever used it. Other meditation and health apps for your mental well-being. So now you are using an app that says, I am anxious today, give me a meditation for that. I'm sad today, I'm overwhelmed. Who's buying that data?
We have a colleague here at Oxford who's an expert in marketing, and he told me that the latest analytics of simply Gmail content can predict public sentiment 3 months out. So all the volume of all the text Gmails that everybody sent today can be, he can use it to imagine what public mood will be like many weeks ahead. But what you're describing seems much more directed, all right, or much more personal and directed at capturing a particular community or a particular segment of the population.
Well, it's almost, if you saw that Tom Cruise movie years ago, it's almost pre-crime. It's almost, you were able to, and indeed, you know, some of these guys I interviewed talked about it. You were able to predict people's behavior based on their prayer requests, because you will know who's heading for divorce. And through this platform now you can see, okay, they're heading for addiction, they're heading for divorce, and he's just lost his dad. So, you know, you have information on people that will tell you where their problems are. And now, yes, that could be used for good, but it has just enormous potential for harm.
Okay, then let's run with this, Charles.
Oh, I just want to say, as we know, it's not binary. It's not either you're targeting the mass or you're targeting the individual. All of this targeting is happening at the same time. All the sentiment analysis is happening at the same time. So, and forgive me, I'm not chugging vodka or beer, by the way, as I talk about Christianity. It's just the biggest glass of water I could find.
Nice big key. Yeah, important to stay hydrated. Well, on the topic of these analytics, we have a great question from Maria about Cambridge Analytica, and the probably the reasonable behavioral research that their assumptions were based on, right? So much of their techniques are based on the social science, the behavioral science that has existed for a long time and that enabled the models. In your mind, are there ways that that level of behavioral analytics could be used constructively, ethically, or in your experience, it's not possible, or doomed to fail?
In the case of Cambridge Analytica, it's important to point out that it was done without people's explicit permission, that they were not aware of what was happening, that they were operating outside the rule of law, and specifically because they were dealing with mental health data at certain points, and that the public was generally unaware that these things were happening. It also broke. This is a tough one because Facebook would tell you that it broke their terms and conditions, but it didn't, because that was Facebook's model as they were trying to make the transition from desktop to gaming. I know because I was working in gaming at the time and was a registered Facebook developer, so I know what was available to people. So it wasn't uncommon at all what was available to Cambridge Analytica. But this rule of law, transparency, etc. This is really critical. So when people say, well, couldn't it be good to target somebody who is an addict, who is also going through a great deal of grief because they've just lost a relative, and they're suffering from financial distress, and so that you can reach out and help them? I would say, well, actually, that's just none of your business.
Mm.
They can reach out and ask for help, but it's not your business.
Okay, let me artificially let me put forward a scenario I've been thinking about here. If you could use some of the behavioral analytics to encourage COVID vaccination uptake, would you, or would that not be worth? Would that be an application not worth playing with, or in what circumstances?
I think Kat should talk now.
I'm fascinated and horrified by the anti-vax thing. So it's an interesting question. I think it's always problematic. I think the best, giving the right kind of information at the right time and telling the right kind of emotional stories is what we really have to work on and get good at.
Mhm.
I'm not sure that using, yes, maybe on a case-by-case scenario, using the kind of manipulation techniques could work out really well. And in the case of a pandemic, there's exceptional cases and things like that. But when you can't regulate who's behind it, and who's behind it are often for-profit companies, it's so easy for it to sprawl out in the wrong direction. But there's no doubt that things are extremely necessary right now. What's really necessary with the vaccinations, for example, is to get the right kind of information out and not flood the space with bad info.
Yeah.
Somewhere, we have to use some kind of behavioral technique, and one of them could just be how do we tell good emotional stories that trump the stories of going, you will die if you take a vaccine.
Yeah. So I often get a variation of this kind of question, and it's usually about this annual review that we do of government expenditures on social media manipulation. And the programs that we don't tend to worry too much about or count in a study of misinformation are the ones that involve, say, targeting young women with messages to prevent them from going to Syria to be ISIS brides, right? There's some fairly narrow things like that we don't worry about as state-backed misinformation. What about climate change? Would you ever want to see an aggressive information operation from a democracy encouraging people to get into the stories around climate change?
I think you almost have to weigh all of the different words in there. What do we mean by aggressive? What do we mean by an information operation? And is it open and transparent? So I think all of those things are important, and all of those things are problematic at the same time. An open and transparent information operation is something that is usually pretty ineffective, because the moment you put the Home Office logo,
Pink elephant, yeah,
nobody pays any attention, or
right.
FCO or something like that. I do think that there is validity in countering disinformation campaigns. So if there is an anti-climate change campaign that's out there, it's perfectly reasonable to have an information campaign to try to change things. It's what was the big campaign in America for a while?
Smoking, the truth.
Breathe it in, we breathe it out.
Right, the truth one that was based in Florida, smoking truth, something like that.
Yes. So I think those are important. So whether it's around climate change or it's young women going to Syria, if there is a disinformation campaign, then countering that becomes really important.
There's also, from a filmmaker's perspective, purely, what is a campaign? It can be many things, and how do you change opinions? You can do it in many ways. And I know that there's a lot of channels out there, for example, right now, who are looking at ways of telling stories about climate change and about taking care of the planet for the future. And how do you tell that from a maker's perspective in film and TV? And encouraging good behavior, but you do it through fictional stories.
Mhm.
And you can use facts, and this is for the good of everyone. There's very low potential for harm in that regard. Of course, you can also do the opposite. You can make a TV series about how things are a hoax. I've seen plenty of deep state TV things going out there. So, but that's one way. Again, telling good, compelling stories that encourage good behavior.
Mhm. We have a question from somebody in our audience, from Alexa in our audience. Has the CNP changed their tactics or goals since being exposed by your doc, or even since Trump left office?
You want me to kick off with that a little bit, Kat?
Yeah.
So they haven't gone away. Their real power, and certainly there was real power when Trump was in office. I think power that they were even surprised that they had. But their real power lies at the state level and in state legislatures. And there is still the opportunity to change the United States Constitution, because state houses are majority held by Republicans and CNP-backed Republicans. So they're still out there operating those levers. My understanding is that Mike Flynn has a role coming up in the Council for National Policy, although it hasn't quite been announced just yet. Mike Flynn's brother is in the news right now as well, around the Capitol riot or the insurrection. So there are, it's dodgy, because when you start talking about all the different connections between people, and when you start building the mad wall, you begin to sound like a conspiracy theory person. And I have some theories about why people believe in conspiracy theory. But the truth is, there are conspiracies out there. Al-Qaeda really did want to kill all of us. It's true. There are the United States capitalism works hand in hand with the government in foreign countries. Yes, that's absolutely right. So there are truths that you can document that still make you sound like you're mad.
Well, so in terms of the CNP, they are I don't know how much they changed based on our doc. The best thing they could ever do was to ignore us. That's the smarter thing to do, because the more attention you draw to it, they wouldn't want that. Glue did. They published an open letter calling it conspiracy theory, which we were very happy about. And they simultaneously denied being a Christian company, which is hilarious, given that the founders sat and talked to me for hours about their goal to advance the kingdom. But the CNP's goals have changed on a flow basis for the entirety of their existence. So, way before the election, as far back as January, February, the meeting after the one Charles crashed, they started touting mail-in fraud and that the election was fraudulent.
Right.
And the beginning of 2020, mind you, that they built that from scratch. The election is fraudulent. Mail-in voting is a huge problem, because they know that that's what Democrats do. So they built that whole machine, and then now losing, despite putting every machine behind it, it's the next thing is to suppress the vote, and particularly suppress the Black vote. And that's they're working hard in each legislature to do that right now.
Their real number one priority operating right now, and I think you'll probably agree with this, Kat, is that they want to end lockdown. It's just really critical to their funders that they end lockdown, because it is the extractive industries.
Right. Kat, can we focus in on your time doing the difficult work in the documentary? So if Charles had his time with the committee and running around with the backpack and being anxious of it over his meetings, you definitely interviewed some church folks who might have gotten a sense of what you were trying to uncover in one of the interviews. Did you have a plan if you'd been outed by one of the members of the network, or do you have a quick exit or a safety word of some kind that gets you out of a situation quickly?
Well, in this case, I told them the truth, which was the easiest thing to do. And what was so interesting was I told them, at the time I didn't know how far the rabbit hole went. So, I may have omitted one or two things, but I told them that I was making a documentary on Christian outreach programs, like the ones they were running, and, and how they gathered data and how the data worked and all of that stuff. And they were very, very happy to talk to me about it because they're selling a product. And that was their main goal. They wanted to sell that product. Yes, there were one or two hairy moments, particularly with de Gans, where I think he was kind of wondering who this strange Scandinavian woman was talking to him, really. But yeah, if we'd been outed, there was really nothing to out at that point. They could have said, your question. I tried not to go too far on the questions that would alienate them. That was the only thing. I didn't want to put them right on the spot so they would just back off completely. I just wanted to get as much information as possible. But they were very forthcoming, as you can see.
Sorry, they were what?
They were very forthcoming.
Very forthcoming, yeah.
And de Gans, no, he didn't really want to talk about Cambridge Analytica, but the reason for that was because by that time they already had a bad rep.
Right.
Want to be associated with them.
Right. So we have another 15 minutes or so together. I just want to remind everybody that you can drop questions into the Q&A. You can also upvote the favorite of the questions, and there's a batch there already. So either please generate something fresh or choose something to upvote. Before we return to the questions, I want to ask you a little bit about collaborating with academics. And I'm going to do this first by sprinkling some safety dust. So you can say you have permission to talk frankly. And I'll start by saying that I find working with journalists mostly rewarding in the sense that there's a little bit of a learning curve. There's different values on what counts in putting together the text that goes out. Print works different from video, visual. And of course, there's a wide range of professional values based on what kinds of organization, professional journalists you're working with. As an academic, we often get funders these days who want us to think creatively about disseminating our work. And impact is not publishing articles. Impact is not doing a peer review article anymore. Impact is a host of other things. How do you like to collaborate with academics, or what kinds of collaborations work, or do you steer clear? And it's fine if you steer clear of them, but what do you think about, from the documentarian's point of view, collaborating with researchers?
Well, there's a lot of big personalities involved, I would say. So it's really on a project by project basis for somebody like us. You start with the idea that you have, and you start going out to, okay, so who would be an expert in this area? And it can be journalists, academics, it can be professors, it can be all kinds of things. And if they're amenable, you kind of just have to try and cover all your bases in terms of being factual, in terms of having different sides of the story. Here, it naturally presented itself because Brent Allpress reached out to us, and Charles already had so many people he was collaborating with through the committee. So we've kind of given things a little easier on this round.
I think that academia is not a vertically integrated institution, and there's every kind of personality and every kind of situation that you're going to run across. So, as to add to what Kat said, it's you're working with people on a case-by-case basis. I think journalists in general might get frustrated working with academia because the pace is very different, and that the pace needs to be dealt with. And we've seen some horrible accidents, let's say in the last year, with lots of pre-pub papers making it into the newspaper and making it into the news, and then ending up having to be retracted, or some of the information is not accurate. The journalists are as guilty of that as the academics who release the information to the newspapers. So there's a lot of responsibility. There's a frustratingly leisurely pace to making documentaries that makes it more suited to working with academics, I think.
Interesting.
We also
then
had Anne Nelson, who had already published her book, and that was helpful. I mean, she's a journalist and now an author, and that sort of made things a little easier because she had already sort of put that out into the space, and it had been vetted and published. So,
but it sounds like the key point is that you're not those kinds of collaborations may be better if the journalists are not working to deadline, if there isn't a print deadline.
yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. And I also think my experience with journalists who are working to deadline, and especially very ambitious journalists at big institutions where there are a lot of stakeholders, is things that may have been assurances suddenly disappear, things that you may have been promised won't be exposed suddenly are exposed, because there are other stakeholders, and the parameters change. Yeah.
And with a current affairs doc, you kind of have two choices to make there. You either try to keep up with the news or you don't. And you can try and if you keep up with the news, it's very useful to be very topical and have one thing to say. If we were going to go for, okay, we have a revelation that Sven Hughes had, for instance, and we're going to make something around that. Like the Channel 4 doc had the Cambridge Analytica files from the voter suppression in 2016. They made the doc about that. That is one thing. We had this sprawling, huge web that made it very clear very quickly that we couldn't keep up. There were too many developments and too many things happening. So you can't really make it about this is in the news right now. It takes too long. I remember speaking to the creator of the Edward Snowden doc at the time in the beginning. And she said, the editor, that they just chose to make a good film and wait rather than try to journalistically sort of introduce Snowden at the time. They thought, well, we're going to let the news cycle do its thing, and then we'll come with the movie.
But what I would say is, if you are an academic or a department and you're going to work with journalists, just know what you're getting into. Understand that there are different kinds of documentaries. You know, there are breaking news documentaries, and then there are documentaries that may be based on some research that you did 5 years ago, but someone's trying to bring it out into the light, and establish that understanding as early as possible, and if you can, lay some ground rules.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think from the academic's point of view too. So we have one of our attendees today is Mark Zuckerberg, and his question is, if you had the ear of President Biden, what would you ask him to do in terms of regulating the social media firms? So this is always a tough question, right? Do you have a policy solution?
I'm the silence, I think, means in my court. So first, Mark, thanks for coming along. I appreciate it. I know a fellow named Damian Collins who'd love to have a chat with you about many things. I have so many policy solutions that I would like to recommend, and around Facebook. I mean, first of all, specifically, I think the company should be broken up. And that the assets need to be distributed in whatever way they possibly can, and whatever work has been done to integrate the back end of the different aspects of the platforms, of the 99 or so acquisitions that Facebook has made over the course of its lifetime. I don't think that should count for not breaking them up. I think it's really important to do that, and the government should pay a lot of attention to what's going on with the data. Moving forward, I think that a duty of care regulation needs to be established around social media, and that's really very important. You know, in setting regulation around work, there's no way that politicians can anticipate all the possible situations where someone can be hurt at work, but by introducing duty of care, you introduce a way that this can be approached and people can look at it. And then third, I think, you know, there's an issue of transparency around algorithms and what algorithms are doing and how specifically they're privileging certain kinds of content and certain kinds of posts, whether it's user-generated content or not. And just as HMRC will come and embed somebody in your company, or the IRS will if you're big enough, I think that someone could be embedded in your company to understand the algorithms that are at work there, and perhaps help advise you on your policy regarding those algorithms. And perhaps that person might not best be the former deputy prime minister.
One of the solutions that Pomerantsev has offered, and Anne's offered, and Applebaum's offered, involves a hold, right? The 24-hour pause period between making a social media post and actually having it show up. Kat or Charles, does that seem like a reasonable fix, sort of to slow down the media cycle, or is it a SOP?
I have an opinion, but you go first, Kat.
No, I think on the policy front, I will call myself a filmmaker and defer to you. I respect Anne and Peter's work enormously. I really do, and I respect their thinking. And I haven't specifically read their writing on this subject, so let me put that caveat right in front of this. But based on what you've just said, Phil, it strikes me that would turn social media into a different kind of product. And you would strip the essence of what social media is away from it. I think there might be some other approaches, although I'm not prepared to say what they should be. But look, this is hard. It's really hard. And if it were easy, we could do it easily. But I think the safety of society is critical, and we have to privilege the safety of society. And yet there are things that we want to protect within these companies, but it's not necessarily exponential growth and monopoly.
Yep, that makes sense. When academics write, we usually write for another specialized audience. And when you create, you have a very broad audience. There's a really good question here about sort of these dual goals. Taking down the companies a lot, breaking up the monopolies, exposing them, and the public education aspect. How do you know when you're successful, when you're reaching your audience? And do you think you've been successful, and have you reached your audience?
Well, never as much as anyone would like, right? But the glue letter was one thing that we were quite happy. When the trolling or the conspiracy accusation starts, that you've reached some of your goal. So that was certainly good, but it's hard to measure these days for a lot of reasons. Oh, I wonder if we've frozen here.
I think that so I saw. And I was part of a little conversation on Twitter with a man whose wife was an alcoholic and child had been recruited into a church. And the film had given him some answers about what happened. And I think that was good and important. And I took an enormous amount of comfort from that, even though as Kat will attest, I'm extremely demanding in terms of what I want as results go. But I'm not a gosh, if we just touch one person somewhere, then our job is done. I'm not that guy. But this touched me.
Yeah, and the grassroots, as Charles says, it has been good. We've had a lot of reach out. And I particularly was interested in what the Christian community had to say, because it's very easy to, if you haven't watched the film, or to dismiss it as anti-Christian or something like that. But in fact, I grew up evangelical myself, and I just thought, this is fundamentally something that's making people come together. And I was very interested to hear from the people who do trust in that institution and feel like, how did they feel about their data being used that way? And that's the people I've been really happy to hear from.
Well, if I can pay the two of you a compliment, I think one of the things that makes this this work among the most interesting is that it is focus. It does have that focus. It's not a broad look at the entirety of Silicon Valley. It's not produced for the broadest possible Netflix audience. There's a number of important documentary efforts out there, but this has got some focus, which I think means that you must have other stories in that data. Are you allowed, just in the last few minutes, to say a little bit about what might be next, or what's interesting you these days?
Well, we have two projects that we're shooting right now, so we can talk a little bit about that. One
in London, and you're in Oslo right now.
Yes, COVID shooting, which is always really fun. But these people you may know is kind of linked loosely with these two next projects for various reasons. One is called Disinformed, working title still, but that is specifically around disinformation and how we can tell a short, snappy, interesting, fun, engaging story of how we got to, a place of that an insurrection takes place in the United States. And so it's more focused towards the disinfo side, and particularly around this idea of the overlap between the far left and far right communities, essentially people like the wellness communities, merging with people like far right supremacists, and essentially you'll find them on the same page touting the same things like anti-lockdown or things like that. And it's a very strange thing that happened, so we're deep diving into that. And the other part is narcissism and psychopathy in everyday life, not the grand serial killers or the big names, but rather the ones you find in your parents, your bosses, your partners, your everyday people.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for spending time with us to talk about your documentary. It was wonderful to watch, and it's of course wonderful to have a look behind the scenes and talk about your big ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
Great to be here.
Thank you, Kat and Charles and Phil as well, for that amazing insight today. It's been really brilliant to be able to hear from everyone and to be able to actually meet the people behind the screen and really ask those questions. So thank you so much. And we're going to be sending up a follow-up email in due course, which will have a link to the film. We do actually have the film, the full film available for you to watch. So we'll be sending that out, and that will be up till the end of the week so that you've got time to view the film if those who haven't had the opportunity to do so. So please do use that link and look out for that email from us. Our events program for this term has now come to a close for the Easter break, but we urge you to keep an eye on our website for the upcoming summer events program, which will be listed soon. So thank you all very much for attending, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.